After finding out the marriage certificate was fake, I called up my boys and hit the club. "Aren't you scared your general wife's gonna show up and drag you out of here?" My buddy was clowning me, but I was on the dance floor going off. Not a single worry in the world. No wife. We never even filed the paperwork. Wait, what? He thought he heard me wrong. Jaw completely dropped. I just smirked and leaned into his ear. I said, "Me and Wenning never legally got married." The second those words left my mouth, the whole bar went dead silent. Everyone was staring at something behind me. My buddy was going crazy with the eye signals, and I finally clued in that something was off. My gut dropped. I slowly turned around. Under the flickering lights, Wenning's veins were popping on her forehead, eyes bloodshot. She just crushed her glass with her bare hand. See, when Wenning and I got married, she got transferred to the Port City Military District as a Major General. I gave up everything to follow her out there, and 5 years later I couldn't even get a basic tempid card. Meanwhile, the orderly who came with us had already used Wenning's connections to get full residency. I was so done. I started packing my bags to go back home, and for the first time ever, she, too proud to beg, got teary-eyed and asked me to stay. "You've still got me. Don't stress about all that. Residency goes through official channels, and my position is sensitive right now. I can't be seen pulling strings." As for Zijian, the guy left everything behind to come here. Getting him settled first is what a good commanding officer does. My heart softened. I dragged my suitcase back to the corner. Then one day I went to the political office to handle Wenning's leave cancellation paperwork. I pulled out the marriage certificate to verify it, and the clerk said, "Sir, our system shows that Major General Wen's registered spouse is not you. Please verify and come back." I froze right there on the spot. Turns out, from the very beginning, I was never her husband. Not legally. So what family housing benefits, what job placement, none of that was ever mine. I didn't say a word. I gathered my things and quietly booked the next available flight back home. Some goodbyes you just don't say out loud. I got back to the family quarters and tried the face scanner 5 times. Every single time, verification failed. I snapped out of the shock just enough to double-check. Yeah, I had the right place. The lock just wasn't the one Wenning and I installed together when we first moved in 5 years ago. I called Wenning. She picked up fast. I could hear the bass bugle in the background. "What's up? Would the lock get changed?" "It was fine this morning." 2 seconds of silence. "This afternoon Zijian said the lock on his dorm broke. Replacement through logistics would take 3 days. He said he was used to ours, so I just took it off and gave it to him. Got a new one. Just haven't had time to add your face yet. Go stay at the base guest house tonight. I'm on duty, not coming home." Zijian's lock breaks, so she pulls ours off the door and sends me, the man of the house, to sleep at a guest house. I genuinely thought my ears were broken. I opened my mouth to say something, but all that came out was okay. What else was I gonna say? This was our home, and now some outsider's face was the one unlocking the door. They say he'd been staying there since he arrived in Port City, even had his own room, so of course he was used to the lock, right? I hung up and checked into the guest house. $560 a night. The low balance notification, when I swiped, stung. When we first got to Port City, Wenning gave me a secondary card linked to her pay, and said spend freely. Then Zijian gradually took over handling all her day-to-day stuff, uniforms, gear, military-grade thermos. He bought all of it. Little by little the card ended up in his hands. Wenning started just wiring me for $1,000 a month for living expenses. She said he knew military life better than me, that he bought the right things, that he was just doing his job as an orderly. So I let it go. Then came our 5th wedding anniversary. I cooked all her favorite dishes. I wanted it to be just the 2 of us. Food barely hit the table and the doorbell rang. Wenning opened it. Zijian was standing there, out of breath. He shoves a box of ultra-thin condoms at her. "Major General, big day for you. I got these specially." He glanced at me, totally relaxed. "You always say this brand feels the best." Thoughtful of me, right? Go ahead. Say it. Wenning took them with an awkward, waved him off, and closed the door. She walked back to the table and set the box down without a second thought. I just stared at her, couldn't say a word. I never even knew which brand she preferred, because we hadn't been using protection at all. We were trying to have a kid. That meal tasted like nothing. Then she said there was an emergency meeting at the base, grabbed her jacket, and left. The moment that door shut, it hit me. So this is how far an orderly's job description goes. That night I dreamed about the day we first arrived in Port City. I walked out of the airport dragging 2 suitcases. Wenning was waiting at arrivals in her dress uniform, the stars on her epaulets catching the light. Back then she felt guilty that I dropped everything to follow her. She'd get teary and carry my bags herself. She took care of me through every bout of homesickness. Then Zijian showed up. She said he had it tough. Leaving home, said she wanted to help. Got him residency. Got him a formal orderly position. Never thought that in the end, she'd also hand him the locks to my home. First thing the next morning I went to buy a ticket back home. Waiting at a crosswalk, my phone buzzed. It was a friend back home. Hey, about that thing you asked me to look into. He paused, voice hesitant. I pulled some strings, but all I could get was the registration info. They keep that stuff locked down tight. Couldn't pull the full file. It's fine. Whatever you found works. 2 seconds of silence. Then came the words that made my blood run cold. Wenning's registered spouse in Port City, last name Z. I couldn't speak. My buddy asked, "You good?" I forced a smile into my voice. "Yeah, I'm good. Thanks." Hung up. The light turned green. The crowd moved. I just stood there staring at the walls of the military base across the street. Sea breeze carrying that cold, salty bite. Last name Z. Zijian. Her real spouse had been by her side this whole time. I laughed. Just started laughing, tears streaming down my face. 5 years. 5 years of trying to prove I belonged there, too proud to just be the trailing spouse. I kept chasing a job and missed every single sign. Like how every weekend she said she was running drills all day. I'd ask if she was tired. She'd always say, "You wouldn't get it, it's military stuff." Or that time she forgot her duty roster and I dropped it off at her office, and saw 2 sets of toiletries on the shelf in her private room. One black, one blue. I never let myself think too hard about it. I pulled myself back to the present, and got in line at the airport ticketing counter. Reminded me of 5 years ago. The line to check in at Port City was insane, but I didn't care because I was finally going to see her. Even the unfamiliar ocean wind felt warm. When Wenning found me, she picked me up, and spun me around, grinning ear to ear. Then Zijian walked up in his fatigues, and snapped a salute. "Major General, what a coincidence. Zijian and I were on the same flight." Wenning laughed and grabbed his bag. "Oh right, forgot to mention, Zijian's coming on as my orderly. Kid's a long way from home, not easy." Zijian gave me a polite nod. "Gee Huey, hope you'll look out for me." My smile went stiff. I nodded back anyway. On the ride back I sat there watching them talk. He'd go on about training, life at the base, and Wenning would turn to actually listen. He pointed out the coastal watch towers through the window, and she'd look right where he pointed. That attention she used to give only me, quietly. A piece of it was already his. My chest ached, but I told myself to be happy for her. A reliable orderly is hard to find. Having someone she trusted follow her out here, it'd only make her transition easier. The first few months in Port City I was putting in applications everywhere, trying to land an admin role at one of the mainland schools there. But without a Port City'd, my out-of-region credentials hit a wall every time. Sent out dozens of resumes, either ghosted completely or got back. Not currently hiring non-local residents. I was a straight-A student my whole life. Went all the way through grad school. Rejection wasn't something I knew. For a while I couldn't sleep, kept thinking maybe I just wasn't good enough. Eventually I had no choice. I brought it up with Wenning. She came home from training one night and I walked over with a glass of water, fumbling over my words. "Hey, could you maybe ask around at the base? Aren't there spots set aside for family members?" I was thinking if maybe a job could be arranged. I trailed off. I'd never asked anyone for a favor in my life. Using connections, even if it was a perk I was entitled to. I felt my face go hot just saying it. She kept her head down, polishing her boots. Didn't even look up. "If you want to work, I'll ask around." I felt a weight lift off my chest. Then I waited 5 months. When I brought it up again, she said things had been hectic at the base. "Maybe another time." I want to tell you about the rest of that 5-month wait, because it wasn't just silence. It was 5 months of small, specific humiliations I kept explaining away one at a time. The way you talk yourself out of noticing a house is on fire because you can only smell smoke from one room at a time. I want to mention one more thing before the family dinner, because it's the moment I've come to think of, looking back, as the exact instant I should have finally understood something was fundamentally broken. 6 weeks into that same period, I finished a certification course I'd been quietly working through online at night, hoping it might finally open a door somewhere in Port City's tightly closed hiring market. I told Wenning about it the evening I passed, genuinely excited for the first time in months, and she promised, warmly, to take me out to celebrate that weekend, just the two of us. That Saturday came and went with an unexpected training rotation, so did the following one. By the 3rd weekend, I stopped mentioning it, and she never once brought it up again either. The certificate itself eventually filed away in a drawer I didn't open again for years. A small, quiet monument to an achievement nobody in that house had time to actually notice. 3 weeks after I first asked, the base held its annual Family Appreciation Dinner, the one formal event each year where officers introduced their spouses to the wider command. Wenning walked the room all evening with her hand resting, briefly and constantly, on Zijian's shoulder, as she introduced him to colonel after colonel. "This is Zijian, my orderly, came out with me from home. Sharp kid, going places." When a young captain finally asked, gesturing at me standing awkwardly near the drinks table, "And this is?" Wenning paused just half a second too long before saying, "Oh, this is Lin Zhou, my other half. Family stuff." The captain nodded politely and turned right back to Zijian, who was already telling a story about a training exercise. I stood there holding a glass of orange juice for the rest of the night while my wife's entire social circle learned my husband's orderly's life story, and forgot mine within the same conversation. A month later, I came down with a bad fever, the kind that had me barely able to stand, and called Wenning's direct line 4 times without an answer. I finally reached the base operator, who told me the Major General was unreachable, in a closed-door strategy session. Zijian showed up at the door 20 minutes later with medicine and a thermometer, telling me, almost proudly, that he'd heard I wasn't feeling well and came right over. I asked him how he'd heard, since I hadn't told anyone but Wenning. He just smiled and said, "Word travels fast around here." Wenning came home 4 hours later, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, and told me she'd been in meetings the entire time. I believed her, because believing her was easier than doing the math on how Zijian had known before she'd even walked through the door. The job request itself resurfaced twice more after that first 5-month wait, and each time it dissolved into the same vague promise. The third time, nearly 2 years in, I finally learned, from a base administrator who let it slip during an unrelated conversation, that a family placement position had, in fact, opened up at the district's logistics office 18 months earlier, one I would have qualified for easily, and that Wenning had personally declined it on my behalf, citing, in the official memo, that her spouse preferred to pursue opportunities independently. I never asked her about that memo. By then I think some part of me already understood that asking would only get me another version of the same practiced, patient lie, and I wasn't sure yet which was worse, her lying to my face, or the version of myself who kept choosing to believe it anyway. That's the 5 years I carried into that club, the night the certificate finally surfaced. Standing there under the flickering lights, watching Wenning's hand close around a broken glass, I understood, for the first time with total clarity, that none of it had ever been an accident, a delay, a misunderstanding born of a demanding career. It had been a structure, built patiently and deliberately, with me standing in the exact spot she needed a devoted, blameless husband to stand in, while the actual marriage lived somewhere else entirely, behind a door I'd never once been given a key to. I didn't wait for her to speak. I set my drink down, nodded once to my friends, and walked out of that club into the warm, salt-heavy port city night for what I already knew would be the last time. I didn't fly home that night. I spent it instead walking the length of the harbor boardwalk, past the guest house that had cost me $560 I could no longer justify spending, past the base gates I would never again need clearance to pass through, turning over 5 years of my life like a man finally allowed to read a book he'd been holding upside down the entire time. My buddy called me the next morning, before my flight, filling in what happened after I walked out. Wenning, apparently, hadn't moved from that spot for nearly 10 minutes, glass shards still scattered around her boots, while the entire bar slowly went back to its own conversations around her, the way crowds do once the immediate drama passes, but the awkwardness lingers. She'd finally turned to leave herself, my buddy said, and Zijian, who'd apparently been waiting outside the entire time, stepped forward to steady her by the elbow the moment she reached the door, a small, automatic gesture of ownership that told my buddy, watching from across the room, everything he needed to understand about who had actually been managing that relationship for years. Neither of them said a word to each other on their way out. He told me they just left together, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I think that detail, more than the glass or the silence or even the certificate itself, was what finally let me stop wondering whether I'd overreacted. I landed back home 2 days later, in the same small, gray-skied city I'd left 5 years earlier with 2 suitcases and a heart full of stupid, hopeful certainty. My mother cried at the arrival's gate, the same way Wenning once had, though for entirely different reasons, and asked me, gently, whether I wanted to talk about it. I told her not yet. I needed, first, to figure out who I actually was without a marriage that had apparently never existed on paper propping up every decision I'd made for half a decade. That first week home was, honestly, The hardest of the entire experience, harder even than the moment in the political office, when the clerk first told me the certificate didn't exist. I spent most of it in my childhood bedroom, which my mother had never redecorated, surrounded by trophies and photographs from a version of myself who'd never once imagined his life would eventually hinge on a lock he no longer had the face scan to open. I didn't answer most calls that week, including 2 from numbers I recognized as old Port City contacts, people who'd clearly heard some version of the story and wanted details I wasn't ready to give anyone. My mother left food outside my door most mornings without commentary, the same quiet, patient care she'd shown me through every difficult stretch of my childhood. And I remember thinking, somewhere around day 5, that I'd forgotten entirely what it felt like to be cared for without an unspoken cost attached. It was my old university mentor, Professor Kang, who found me first, rather than the other way around. He'd heard through a mutual colleague that I was back in the city, and called me himself within the week. Gruff and characteristically impatient with small talk. "Lin Zhou, are you working right now?" I told him, honestly, that I wasn't. That I'd spent 5 years chasing a job in Port City that never once materialized. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, then said something that changed the entire shape of what came next. "Good. Come to my office tomorrow. There's something I should have told you 5 years ago, and I let my own cowardice about interfering in your marriage stop me." I want to explain what he meant, because it mattered more than almost anything else that happened in that first month home. 5 years earlier, just before I left to follow Wenning to Port City, Professor Kang had quietly recommended me for a position I never seriously considered, because by the time the offer actually came through, my flight to Port City was already booked. The Jiangnan Foundation School, one of the most prestigious private academic institutions in the province, had been searching for a young academic director to help rebuild its upper school curriculum, and Professor Kang had put my name forward on the strength of my graduate research alone. I'd thanked him at the time, told him I'd think about it, and then quietly let the opportunity lapse without ever giving him a real answer. Too swept up in the idea of following Wenning into a new life to seriously weigh what I was choosing to walk away from. The position, as it turned out, had never fully been filled. 2 other candidates had come and gone over 5 years, each one lasting less than 18 months before moving on, and the Foundation's board, according to Professor Kang, had never stopped occasionally asking whether the original candidate might someday resurface. I laughed when he told me that, a short, disbelieving sound, because it felt, after 5 years of being told I wasn't qualified enough for a basic administrative role in Port City, almost cruel to learn that an entire prestigious institution back home had spent years quietly wondering if I might come back. Jiang Yao was the Jiangnan Foundation's Director of Academic Affairs by then, a position she'd built over 5 patient years, from the same entry-level curriculum coordinator role she'd held back when we were both graduate students in Professor Kang's research group. I hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, not since the awkward, half-finished conversation we'd had the week before I left for Port City, when she'd asked me, carefully, whether I was certain about following Wenning, and I'd told her, with the particular arrogance of a man freshly in love, "That's some things you simply know." She'd wished me well. She hadn't said anything else, though I remembered, walking away from that conversation, a specific stillness in her expression that I hadn't let myself examine too closely at the time. I learned, much later, from Professor Kang rather than from Jiang Yao herself, who never once volunteered the detail unprompted, that she'd been offered a position at a considerably more prestigious university system in the capital about 2 years into my absence, a move that would have meant leaving the Jiangnan Foundation and the city, and, though she never said this part out loud to anyone, the faint possibility that I might someday come back through that particular door. She turned it down, quietly, without much explanation to anyone who asked, and threw herself instead into building the Foundation's academic program into something worth staying for on its own terms, regardless of whether I ever walked back through it. Professor Kang told me he'd always assumed, watching her make that choice, that some part of her simply refused to let a decision she couldn't control keep dictating the shape of the career she absolutely could. She was the one who actually interviewed me for the academic director position, sitting across a conference table in an office I remembered visiting once as a graduate student, her expression professional and unreadable in a way that made the first 20 minutes of that conversation considerably more nerve-wracking than I'd expected. It was only near the end, once the formal questions were finished, that her composure cracked slightly. "I heard you moved back," she said, setting down her pen. I wasn't sure whether to be glad or sorry. I told her the truth, more of it than I'd told almost anyone since landing back home, and watched her face move through something considerably more complicated than professional sympathy. "I'm sorry that happened to you," she said quietly, when I finished. And I'm sorry it took something that painful to bring you back here. But I'm not sorry you're back. I got the job. It wasn't a formality, and I want to be clear about that, because I've heard enough versions of these stories where the reward simply appears because a woman who loves you happens to be standing nearby. Jiang Yao recused herself from the final hiring vote entirely, telling the rest of the board, plainly, that she'd known the candidate personally for years and didn't trust her own objectivity enough to weigh in. The board hired me on the strength of the same research and recommendations that had first gotten my name onto Professor Kang's list 5 years earlier, work that had apparently only grown more relevant in the time I'd spent thinking none of it mattered anymore. We didn't rush anything, Jiang Yao and I, in those first months of working together. I was still, by any honest accounting, a man freshly out of a 5-year relationship that had turned out to be built on nothing at all, and she was considerably too dignified to let herself become a rebound for someone still working through that particular kind of grief. We had dinner, occasionally, always framed as colleagues discussing curriculum. We took the same slow, deliberate walks around the Foundation's campus after long meetings, talking about everything except the 5-year gap sitting quietly between us. It was nearly 4 months before she finally said, over one of those dinners, the thing I think we'd both been circling since my first interview. I waited a long time for you to come back, Lin Zhou. I'm not in any hurry now that you have. But I'd like you to know that waiting wasn't nothing to me, and I'd like the chance to see what this could actually be. Whenever you're ready to find out. I told her I was readier than I'd expected to be. We started, properly, that same week. My mother met Jiang Yao for the first time, about 2 months into that beginning, over a dinner I'd spent an entire week nervous about arranging. Though I couldn't have told you exactly why given how thoroughly my mother had already made her feelings about Wenning known. She watched Jiang Yao the entire meal, with the particular quiet appraisal I'd grown up recognizing as her most serious form of judgment, the one she reserved for decisions that actually mattered rather than small talk. It was only after Jiang Yao left that evening that my mother finally spoke, drying a dish she didn't technically need to dry, taking her time with the words. She looks at you, the way a person looks at someone they respect, not just someone they've decided to be patient with. I didn't understand, until she said it out loud, exactly how much I'd been missing that specific distinction, for 5 years without having the language to name what was wrong. I threw myself into the academic director role the way I'd once thrown myself into being a good, patient trailing spouse, except this time the effort actually built toward something that belonged to me. Within a year, the curriculum overhaul Professor Kang had first imagined I might lead had produced results considerable enough that 2 regional education journals ran profiles on the Jiangnan Foundation's turnaround, each one mentioning my name directly, a small, strange thrill I hadn't expected to feel as sharply as I did, after 5 years of being introduced at parties as somebody's other half. It wasn't immediate, and I don't want to pretend the transition was some effortless triumph. The first 6 months in the role were genuinely difficult, full of long nights relearning curriculum theory that had shifted considerably during my 5 years away, and at least one entire week where I seriously doubted whether I'd taken on more than I could actually deliver. Jiang Yao found me at my desk past midnight more than once that first season, not offering easy reassurance, which I think I would have resented at the time, but simply sitting with me while I worked through whatever problem was keeping me there, occasionally offering a sharp, useful suggestion and otherwise just being present in the particular, steady way she seemed to manage everything. I told her once, during one of those late nights, that I was terrified of failing publicly at something everyone already knew I'd been quietly waiting 5 years to prove myself capable of. She told me, simply, that failing honestly at something hard was still considerably more dignified than succeeding at pretending a marriage was real. I never forgot that particular piece of perspective. The first time Wenning found out, I later learned from a mutual acquaintance, who still had a foot in both our old Port City circle and my new one, was through exactly one of those education journal profiles, shared jocosely in a group chat of military spouses back in Port City by someone who had no idea of the history behind it. "Isn't this your old husband, Wenning? He's doing well for himself." According to the acquaintance, Wenning had gone quiet in that chat for several minutes before responding with a single, clipped message. "We're not together anymore. I wish him well." Nobody in that chat, apparently, ever learned the fuller story of why. I want to be honest that I didn't feel much of anything reading that second-hand account. When it eventually reached me, weeks later, I'd expected, somewhere in the angrier early months after Port City, that hearing about Wenning's reaction to my success might feel satisfying in some sharp, immediate way. Instead, it mostly felt like reading about a stranger's minor social media moment, a small ripple in a pond I no longer had any real stake in. The satisfaction, when it eventually came, arrived from somewhere considerably more substantial than a group chat message. I learned the rest of what happened to Wenning and Zijian in pieces. Over the following 2 years, mostly through the same mutual acquaintance, a woman named Captain Ye, who had never particularly liked Wenning, and took, I think, a certain grim satisfaction in keeping me informed of the slow unraveling that followed my departure. I should explain why Captain Ye, of everyone in that entire base, ended up the one person willing to keep me informed. She'd served under Wenning for 2 years early in both their careers, back before Wenning made Major General, and had watched her take credit, more than once, for logistic solutions Captain Ye herself had quietly designed, presented upward without a single acknowledgement of whose work it actually was. It never cost Wenning anything to build her own reputation partly on other people's uncredited labor, Captain Ye told me once, and I don't think she ever even noticed she was doing it, because taking things that weren't fully hers had simply become how she moved through the world. I think Captain Ye recognized, watching what happened to me, an uglier, more personal version of the exact same pattern, and decided, quietly, that she wasn't interested in protecting Wenning's image any further than professional courtesy strictly required. The first crack appeared almost immediately, once word of the fake certificate began quietly circulating through the base's tighter social circles. It hadn't been me who leaked it. I never said a word to anyone back in Port City after that night at the club, but the bar had been full of officers and spouses who'd all heard exactly what I said before the whole room went silent, and gossip in a military community, Captain Ye told me, travels faster than any official memo ever could. The story that spread wasn't kind to Wenning, whatever sympathy she might have hoped to generate as the wrong party in a messy public scene. Officers who had spent 5 years watching her introduce me as her husband at every formal function began quietly asking each other exactly what kind of woman kept a devoted man on a 5-year string, housed under her name, financially dependent on her, while her actual husband lived down the hall the entire time. The wives' circle she'd once presided over with easy authority grew noticeably colder. 2 women who had considered themselves close friends of hers for years stopped including her in their regular dinners, one of them telling Captain Ye, plainly, that she couldn't sit across a table from someone who'd let a man believe he had rights and a home for 5 years while quietly making sure none of it was ever actually his. One of those women, a major named Song who had once organized Wenning's entire baby shower planning committee before Wenning and Zijian's trying for a kid turned out to mean something considerably more complicated, confronted her directly at a farewell function neither of them could avoid attending together. According to Captain Ye, who witnessed the exchange firsthand, Major Song asked Wenning, quietly but without any softness in her voice, whether she'd ever once considered what it would feel like to be the man finding out, alone, from a government clerk, that his entire marriage had been fiction. Wenning reportedly had no answer prepared for that question. The first time, Captain Ye said, that anyone had ever seen her fail to have a composed response ready for anything at all. Wenning's mother, a formidable retired colonel herself who had personally approved of the marriage 5 years earlier, found out from a phone call considerably less gentle than the ones Captain Ye had been giving me. A family friend still serving in Port City mentioned it in passing at a dinner, assuming, incorrectly, that the Wen family already knew. According to Captain Ye, who heard the story secondhand from someone present at the family's next gathering, Wenning's mother had gone silent for nearly a full minute before asking her daughter, in front of the rest of the family, whether it was true that she'd let a good man believe he was her husband for 5 years while quietly keeping the real one hidden down the hall. Wenning apparently tried to explain the sensitive nature of her position, the residency complications, the same careful language she'd once used on me. Her mother reportedly cut her off entirely. I didn't raise a daughter to deceive someone who gave up everything for her. I raised you to be better than the men who use rank to avoid consequences. You've become one of them. Wenning's father, considerably quieter than her mother by temperament, said almost nothing during that entire confrontation, according to the same second-hand account, simply setting down his chopsticks and leaving the table without a word. He called me directly, 3 weeks later, the only member of the Wen family who ever did. I didn't approve of everything my daughter did, he told me, his voice careful and formal in a way that told me exactly how much the call was costing his own pride. I want you to know that, whatever else you think of this family, I want you to know that. I thanked him for calling, and told him I didn't hold the rest of the family responsible for choices that were entirely Wenning's own to make. He was quiet for a moment, then said something I've thought about often since. Rank changes how a person moves through a room. It shouldn't change what they're willing to tell the truth about. I'm sorry my daughter forgot that distinction somewhere along the way. The family's disappointment didn't stay private for long. Wenning's parents, prominent enough within military circles that their opinions carried weight beyond their own household, stopped attending the same social functions Wenning frequented, a quiet but unmistakable form of distancing that everyone in that tightly connected community understood immediately for exactly what it was. Wenning, by Captain Ye's account, tried for months to repair the relationship, calling her mother weekly, visiting on leave whenever she could. Her mother took the calls. She never once, as far as Captain Ye knew, fully warmed back up. Zijian's own standing suffered considerably more than Wenning's, in some ways, because the story that spread about him carried none of the sympathy that at least occasionally softened how people spoke about her. He hadn't just been the secret husband. He'd spent 5 years accepting a formal orderly position, a household's worth of spending privileges, and a small, steady stream of favors and preferential treatment, all of it obtained, colleagues began quietly pointing out, through his marriage to the commanding officer he technically served under, an arrangement that sat uncomfortably close to several actual regulations about fraternization and conflicts of interest, even if nobody moved to formally investigate it. 2 junior officers who'd once considered Zijian something of a rising star, sharp, well-connected, clearly headed for a promotion, began, according to Captain Ye, referring to him, privately as the general's houseboy, a nickname that spread through the barracks with the particular cruelty young officers reserve for someone they've decided has gotten ahead by means they don't respect. His actual competence, whatever it might have genuinely been, became impossible for anyone to evaluate fairly once the story of how he'd obtained his position was common knowledge. Requests for reassignment to his unit, which had been steady before, slowed to almost nothing. A promotion board that had seemed, 18 months earlier, likely to advance him, quietly passed him over without explanation, though Captain Ye suspected the explanation wasn't difficult to guess. Captain Ye described one particular argument between the two of them, overheard by a junior officer walking past Wenning's office, with the door not fully closed, that seemed to capture exactly how quickly the arrangement was souring. Zijian had apparently demanded to know why Wenning hadn't simply divorced me properly years earlier, filed everything correctly, and let their actual marriage exist in the open the way any normal couples would have. You kept us both in a lie because it was convenient for your career, he reportedly said, and now I'm the one paying for a decision that was entirely yours to make differently. Wenning's response, according to the junior officer, was cold and immediate. You knew exactly what this was when you agreed to it, Zijian. Don't stand here now pretending you didn't benefit from every single year of it. The junior officer said neither of them spoke again for the rest of that meeting, and word of the exchange spread through the base within days, adding one more thread to the unraveling that had already begun. Song, the same major who'd once confronted Wenning at that farewell function, reached out to me, directly, oddly enough, almost 2 years after everything had settled. She'd left the military herself, by then, transitioning into a civilian, consulting role, and told me, over a brief and somewhat awkward phone call, that she'd always felt she owed me some kind of acknowledgement for the question she'd asked Wenning that night, even though we'd never actually met. I just kept thinking about you finding out from a clerk, alone, she said. Nobody should learn something that big from a stranger behind a counter. I told her I appreciated the sentiment, and that I'd made my peace with exactly how I found out, mostly because the manner of it, however cold, had at least been unambiguous. Some truths, delivered gently, take years to fully land. Mine arrived all at once, and I think, looking back, that's what actually let me start rebuilding so much sooner than I otherwise might have. I told Song, before we hung up, that if she ever found herself doubting whether asking hard questions out loud actually mattered, she should remember that hers was the first crack in 5 years of a very carefully maintained silence. She laughed, little embarrassed, and said she hoped that was true, though she suspected the truth would have come out eventually regardless. Maybe, I told her, but eventually is a long time to spend not knowing, and I was grateful someone finally asked the question out loud instead of just wondering privately. What surprised me most, hearing about it secondhand, wasn't the social fallout itself, which felt, in a grim way, like exactly the consequence a 5-year deception deserved. It was learning, roughly a year after I'd left, that Wenning and Zijian's own relationship hadn't survived the exposure either, not because either of them suddenly developed a conscience, but because the entire foundation of what they'd built together turned out to depend on nobody ever having to account for it publicly. Once the whispers started, once the easy social standing they'd both quietly enjoyed began evaporating, Captain Ye told me, the two of them started fighting, viciously and often, in a way that base gossip eventually turned into its own separate strand of rumor entirely. The final break, as Captain Ye told it, happened at another formal function, a promotion ceremony neither of them, could avoid attending. Wenning had shown up alone. Zijian, seated several rows back rather than at her side the way he once would have been, was overheard telling a colleague, in a tone that had lost every trace of the easy devotion he'd once performed so well, that he was tired of being blamed for a decision Wenning had made 5 years before he ever technically arrived, that he'd never asked her to lie to anyone, only to be included, and that he didn't see why his career should keep paying for her choices. Word of that comment reached Wenning within the hour. She didn't respond publicly. She simply requested a transfer to a different district 3 weeks later, a request that was approved considerably faster than most administrators expected, by a command structure that Captain Ye suspected was relieved to see the entire mess relocate somewhere else. Her new posting, according to the last update Captain Ye ever gave me before we gradually lost touch, was in a considerably smaller, less prestigious district. A lateral move dressed up as an opportunity, but understood by everyone involved as exactly the quiet demotion it actually was. Wenning never publicly complained about the reassignment, at least not in any way that reached Captain Ye's ears, though I've come to believe that particular silence was its own kind of answer, the same practiced composure she'd once used to explain away 5 years of small cruelties finally being asked to carry something it was never built to hold. I got married to Jiang Yao almost exactly 3 years after I first walked into that Port City club, and learned the certificate had never existed. It was a small ceremony, held on the Jiangnan Foundation's own campus grounds, attended by Professor Kang, who cried more openly than I'd ever seen a man of his gruff temperament cry, and by my mother, who finally, at the reception, told me she'd never once liked Wenning, not from the very first meeting, but had kept quiet because I'd seemed so certain. I insisted, over Jiang Yao's gentle protests, that it wasn't necessary, on filing our actual marriage certificate myself, in person, at the local registry office, the week before the ceremony, watching the clerk print and stamp it while I stood there reading every line twice. Jiang Yao laughed at me for it, gently, asking whether I intended to keep a laminated copy in my wallet for the rest of our lives. I told her, only half joking, that I probably would, and that some things, once you've learned exactly how much their absence can cost you, you never again take for granted. She stopped laughing at that, took my hand instead, and told me she understood completely. A photograph from that ceremony, run in the same regional education journal that had first covered the Foundation's turnaround, apparently made its way, eventually, back to Port City's tighter social circles, the same way most things involving either of us eventually did. Captain Ye told me, months later, that Wenning had seen it. She didn't say anything to anyone at the time, as far as Captain Ye could tell, but a mutual friend who happened to be with her when the photograph came across her feed described her going quiet for a long moment, staring at the screen, before setting the phone face down on the table without comment. It was, according to that friend, the same particular stillness people had started associating with Wenning ever since her mother's disappointment, her transfer, her fights with Zijian, a woman who had built an entire structure of control around her life only to watch every piece of it crumble in a direction she'd never anticipated, while the man she'd once treated as expendable built something that actually lasted. Wenning reached out to me, directly exactly once, almost a year after my wedding, through a message sent to an old number I'd nearly forgotten I still technically owned. I saw the photograph. It read, "You look happy. I'm glad. Genuinely. I've thought a lot about those 5 years, about what I let happen to you, and told myself was necessary. I know I don't deserve an answer, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry, for whatever that's worth now." I showed the message to Jiang Yao before I decided how to respond, mostly out of the same instinct toward complete honesty we'd built our entire relationship around. She read it twice, handed my phone back, and told me, plainly, that she trusted whatever I decided, but that she hoped I'd notice something about the message's timing before I let it move me too much. "She reached out after seeing you happy," Jiang Yao said, "not after actually reckoning with what she did. I'm not telling you not to respond. I'm just asking you to be honest about which version of closure you're actually being offered here." I thought about that for the rest of that first day, and I think it's exactly what allowed me to write back the way I did, with something considerably steadier than either anger or forgiveness. I sat with that message for 2 full days before responding, not because I was uncertain what I wanted to say, but because I wanted to make sure whatever I did say came from a place considerably steadier than anger. When I finally wrote back, it was short. "I appreciate you saying that, and I hope you find whatever peace you're looking for, but I don't think I need anything from you anymore. Not an apology, not an explanation, not even this conversation. I spent 5 years building my entire identity around being useful to you. I'm not interested in spending any more of it processing what that cost me on your timeline. I wish you well, Wenning, I mean that. I just don't need to be part of how you get there. I've thought, more than once, about how differently that message might have read a year earlier. Back when the wound was still fresh enough that any acknowledgement from her would have felt like something I desperately needed. By the time it actually arrived, I'd already built enough of an honest life that her apology landed as information rather than as relief, a small, overdue footnote to a story that had already finished writing itself without her input. I think that's the clearest measure of how far I'd actually come. Not that I stopped caring what she thought entirely, but that her opinion of me had finally stopped being the currency my own sense of worth was priced in. I never heard from her again after that. Captain Ye mentioned, close to a year later, that Wenning had finally made Captain General at her new posting, a promotion that arrived, ironically, right around the same time her personal life had fully stabilized into something considerably smaller and quieter than the version of her life she'd once orchestrated so carefully around keeping two men in place at once. I don't know whether she's happy. I've stopped needing to know. I still run the academic director's office at the Jiangnan Foundation, 5 years into the role now, the same length of time I once spent as somebody's other half, in a marriage that never technically existed. Jiang Yao runs the entire foundation these days, appointed director 2 years ago in a vote that, unlike mine, she absolutely did not recuse herself from earning. We have a daughter now, 3 years old, loud and stubborn in exactly the way Jiang Yao insists she gets from me, though I remember considerably more stubbornness from her side of every disagreement we've ever had. We named her Anzi, a name Jiang Yao chose specifically, meaning peaceful and grounded, a quiet rejection, she told me once, of 5 years spent building a life on foundations that turned out to be entirely fictional. I want her to grow up never once wondering whether the ground under her is real, Jiang Yao said. The week Anzi was born, and I understood exactly what she meant without needing further explanation. My mother, holding her granddaughter for the first time, told me it was the first grandchild she'd ever gotten to meet without secretly worrying, the entire visit, about how welcome she actually was in the room. Jiang Yao's own mother, considerably more reserved than mine, told me something similar on a separate visit that same month, though phrased in her own quieter way. She said simply that watching the two of us together reminded her of watching a house finally get properly wired for electricity after years of everyone pretending the flickering lights were normal. I told her that was, without question, the strangest and most accurate compliment anyone had ever paid our marriage. Professor Kang still calls me into his office occasionally, mostly now just to argue about curriculum decisions neither of us feel strongly enough about to actually disagree over, using the debate as an excuse to keep spending time together. He told me once, not long after my wedding, that he'd always regretted staying quiet 5 years earlier, watching me choose Port City over the position he'd recommended me for, certain even then that it was the wrong choice but unwilling to interfere in someone else's marriage before it had even begun. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. Some doors, I've learned, stay open considerably longer than you'd expect, waiting patiently for you to finally walk back through them, on your own terms, once you're finally ready to recognize which ones were actually worth walking through in the first place. I don't think about Port City much anymore. When I do, it's mostly with a strange, distant gratitude for a certificate that was never real, and for exactly how much that particular lie ended up costing the people who told it, and exactly how little, in the end, it managed to cost me. There's a version of this story where I stayed angry forever, where every good thing that happened afterward was measured against what Wenning and Zijian took from me rather than against what I actually built. I understand why that version would have been easier to tell, and easier, probably, for some of you listening to feel satisfied by, but the honest ending is quieter than that. The satisfaction was never really about watching them lose everything, though I won't pretend that part didn't matter. It was about finally, after 5 years, getting to build a life where nothing I had could be quietly handed to someone else while I wasn't looking. 5 years taught me the difference between being loved and being useful. I hope, if any of you listening are standing somewhere in the middle of that same confusion right now, this story finds you before a government clerk has to be the one to finally tell you the truth. Thank you for staying with me through all 5 years of it. It took a long time to tell, because it took a long time to actually live through, and I wanted to give it the same patience I eventually learned to give myself. Once I finally stopped waiting for someone else to hand me permission to build a life that was completely, unambiguously mine. If there's one thing I'd want anyone hearing this to actually take with them, it's this. Pay attention to the paperwork, yes, but pay even closer attention to the small, quiet moments where someone shows you exactly how much room they're actually willing to make for you in their life. Mine showed me, over and over, in 100 small ways, years before a clerk ever had to say it out loud. I just wasn't ready yet to believe what I was already seeing. There's one more flashback I need to tell you about, because I think it explains, better than almost anything else, why I never fought harder for that marriage once the truth came out. My mother visited Port City exactly once, in our 3rd year there, a trip she'd saved for a full year to afford. Wenning had promised, weeks in advance, to clear her schedule for the visit, to show my mother the base, to make her feel welcome the way a daughter-in-law should. On the day my mother arrived, Wenning canceled at the last minute, citing an unexpected inspection, and sent Zijian instead to pick her up from the airport. A stranger my mother had never met greeting her at arrivals holding a sign with her name misspelled. My mother never said a word of complaint about it, then or since. The particular silent dignity she'd raised me with making direct criticism of my marriage feel, to her, like overstepping. But I remember the look on her face when she finally told me, years later, back home, that she'd cried quietly in the airport bathroom before composing herself enough to greet a stranger pretending to be family. I hadn't protected her from that. I've never fully forgiven myself for not noticing sooner exactly how much smaller Wenning had made everyone around me, over those 5 years. Not just me, Professor Kang told me, much later, over one of our increasingly frequent lunches, exactly why he'd pushed so hard to get me back into that office the moment he heard I'd returned, rather than simply waiting for me to come looking for work on my own. He'd had a graduate student decades earlier, before my time, a brilliant young woman named Hui Fang who'd left a promising academic career to follow her own husband overseas, certain, the way I once was, that some things you simply know. He never heard from her again after she left, no forwarding address, no updates. Just silence that stretched into years and then decades. I've always wondered what happened to her, he told me, staring into his tea rather than at me. Whether she found what she was chasing, or whether she disappeared into someone else's life, the way people sometimes do without ever fully getting to choose it. I wasn't going to let that happen twice in one lifetime, not when I actually had the chance to do something about it, the second time around. I asked Jiang Yao once, fairly early in our relationship, why she'd never married in the 5 years I was gone, given how much time that left for someone as accomplished and genuinely kind as her to find someone considerably less complicated than a man returning from a 5-year fake marriage. She considered the question seriously before answering, the way she considered most things. I dated, a little, she admitted. Nobody ever quite fit the shape of what I already knew I wanted, and I got tired, eventually, of pretending that shape didn't exist just because you weren't available to fill it. I wasn't waiting in some tragic, wasted way. I built an entire career I'm proud of during those 5 years. I just also happened to leave room, without fully admitting it to myself, for exactly this. I told her that sounded like considerably more patience than I deserved. She laughed and told me patience wasn't really the right word. It was closer to conviction, she said. I just needed you to finish learning something the hard way before you were actually capable of receiving what I already knew. The recognition that mattered most to me, professionally, came almost 3 years into the role, when the Provincial Education Board named the Jiangnan Foundation's upper school curriculum a model program for 3 other regional districts to study and adapt. I was invited to present the framework at a provincial conference, the largest audience I'd ever spoken in front of, and Professor Kang sat in the front row, looking prouder than I'd ever seen him look at any of my graduate work, which had once been the thing he was proudest of in our entire relationship. Jiang Yao told me afterward that watching me on that stage, 5 years removed from a man who couldn't get a single interview callback in Port City, felt like watching someone finally get handed a truth he'd always deserved, but never been given the room to prove. That same conference produced an unexpected offer from a rival district superintendent who approached me afterward proposing a considerably larger salary to leave the Jiangnan Foundation and rebuild an entire underperforming district's curriculum from scratch. I thought about it seriously for almost 2 weeks, mostly because some old, wounded part of me still wanted proof, even after everything, that I was capable of building something entirely from nothing rather than simply stepping into a role that had been quietly waiting for me. Jiang Yao, when I finally told her about the offer, didn't try to talk me out of considering it, which I think was exactly the right instinct on her part. She just asked me one question: are you chasing this because it's actually better, or because some part of you still needs to prove you don't need anyone's patience to succeed? I sat with that question longer than I expected to before turning the offer down. I'd spent 5 years mistaking stubborn independence for strength. I was finally ready to let something good simply be good, without needing to prove I'd built it entirely alone. Captain Ye told me about one more moment before she and I gradually lost touch. Once enough time had passed that neither of us particularly needed the updates anymore. Wenning had attended a small regional reunion of officers from her original, commissioning class. The first major social event she'd shown up to since her transfer, and everything that followed. Several of the women who'd once made up her closest circle were there. According to Captain Yes' source, the reception Wenning received was polite, correct, and utterly without warmth. The particular kind of professional courtesy people extend to someone they've collectively decided not to fully welcome back in. Nobody was cruel to her directly. Nobody needed to be. She left the reunion after less than an hour, alone, and didn't attend the following year's event at all. Zijian's own ending, as far as I ever learned it, was considerably less ambiguous. Captain Ye told me, in what turned out to be one of our last real conversations, that he'd separated from the military entirely within 2 years of the scandal breaking. Not dishonorably, technically, but under circumstances everyone involved understood as a quiet mutual agreement to avoid a considerably messier formal review. He tried, briefly, to start a private security consulting business back in his home province, trading on connections he'd built during his years at Wenning's side. Most of those connections, it turned out, had only ever extended to him because of who he was standing next to, and evaporated the moment he was standing there alone. The business folded within a year. I don't know what he's doing now, and I'll admit, without much guilt, that I've never particularly wanted to find out. Some people spend years building an identity around proximity to someone else's power, and I've come to believe there's a specific, quiet justice in watching that identity collapse completely the moment the power moves elsewhere. My daughter turned 3 last spring, and we held a small family day at the Foundation's campus, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable celebration I never once got during 5 years in Port City, where even a wedding anniversary dinner couldn't survive an interruption from someone else's life quietly crowding into mine. Jiang Yao spent the morning chasing our daughter around the courtyard garden while Professor Kang, now well into his 70s, and considerably softer than the gruff mentor I remembered from graduate school, sat on a bench narrating the whole scene to my mother like a proud grandfather, watching a play he'd personally directed. I stood off to the side for a moment, just watching all of it, and felt something I hadn't let myself fully feel in years. Not relief exactly, and not vindication either, but something closer to arrival, the specific, settled feeling of finally standing inside a life that was actually entirely mine, built by people who had never once needed me to disappear in order to feel secure in what we were building together.